So if someone was to ask you, how close is your relationship with your parents? Yeah, you probably say, well, I talk to them every once in a while. Oh, they live right down the street. We see them all the time. Or they passed away. We don't have a relationship anymore. Well, how about relationship with your brother or your sister? Well, one brother I talk to all the time. The other one I don't see that often. One, we do vacation together. The other one, we try to avoid vacation with them. I said, well, how is your relationship with your spouse? They're like, well, today's going pretty good so far. Ask me again tomorrow. How about relationship with your children? Well, it might depend on just how today went. How about your next door neighbor? Depends, right? Well, what if I said, well, how close is your relationship with God? How would you answer that question? How do you even go about measuring your closeness or relationship with God? Do you feel close to him right now? Or do you feel far away from him right now? And how do you even determine which is the case, if you're close or not close? Is it just based on some subjective feeling? That's what most people determine. I just kind of feel close to God right now. I kind of feel in the spirit. We're feeling close right now. Oh, I don't really feel that close to God right now. They're determining their closeness to God based on how they feel about their relationship to God. And these are the kind of ways that we talk about our relationship with God. Sometimes we measure our closeness to God based on maybe spiritual exercises. Well, how often have you prayed lately? How often are you reading the Bible? Did you have a really good devotion this morning? Then you're feeling close to God. Man, I shared the gospel with 3 people today. I feel really close to God. I haven't shared the gospel in a while. I don't really feel that close to God right now. Or maybe you measure it by some experience. You just got back from some retreat. Some of our kids went to student camp. Maybe you went to a retreat. Maybe you went to some revival. And the preaching was great and convicting. The music was next level. Everyone was waving their hands and worshiping God. And you come back on fire and you're like, man, I just feel really close to God right now. Or maybe it's measured by if you've committed a sin recently or you've been walking in obedience lately. That might be a barometer for how you measure if you're close to God or not. And over the years, people have concocted all kinds of silly ideas to try to get close to God, right? They want to be in God's presence, so people take nature walks. I never feel more in tune with God than when I'm on top of a mountain. Well, it's because you're higher up or just away from people? Like maybe, okay, but what is that? Or people take religious pilgrimages, don't they? Catholics travel to the Vatican. Muslims go to Mecca. People go on pilgrimages all the time to just be close to God. They want to walk the steps that Christ walked. Or maybe they follow scripted prayer routines. Monks hid out in the desert for most of their lives trying to be close to God by being away from other people. All these different attempts, arduous attempts, difficult, earnest attempts to try to be close to God. But the reality is, looking at our experience, looking at all these religious practices, they're not a sure guide to determine our closeness to God. What does the Bible say about how we can truly experience the presence of God? I think the answer is atonement. Specifically, the atonement that Christ has won on our behalf. This class on the cross of Christ, a theology of atonement, is all about what it means for you as a sinful person to dwell in the presence of God, now and forever. The only way that is possible is because of atonement. So the title of this course, as I said, is The Cross of Christ, a Theology of Atonement. And in the loci of systematic theology, we talk about the study of Scripture, the study of end times, the study of sin. All these different things have different theological names. This study, this class, falls underneath the category of Christology. Christology, which just means the study of Christ, words about Christ, the study of Christ. But in theology, we divide up the study of Christ into 2 parts. We talk about the person of Christ, and we talk about the work of Christ. Now, ultimately, you can't separate them really, because he can't do what he does except for who he is. But More particularly, when we talk about the person of Christ, usually theologians are referring to the incarnation of Christ, which is a course we offered last fall. If you're interested, we did a course called Who is Jesus? A Theology of the Incarnation. And we studied how it is that Jesus can be both God and man. That's a study of the person of Christ. In this course, we're focusing on the work of Christ, which is talking about his atonement. And the atonement of Christ is what we're focusing on. And in the weeks to come, we're going to spend a lot more time pressing in on more of the theology that's undergirding all of that atonement and how exactly it works and pulling together the different strands of biblical teaching. But I first wanted to tonight, before we get too deep in the course, give a firmer biblical grounding for understanding what the Bible is talking about in referencing the atonement. Just the atonement in general, and specifically, I think the atonement of Christ. And so we're going to be looking tonight at the Day of Atonement, as it's referred to, the Day of Atonement, and that's found in Leviticus chapter 16. And by looking at this Old Testament backdrop, it's going to highlight for us more clearly what the New Testament has to say about the work of Christ. As we look at this passage, there's a lot of details in Leviticus. It's the reason why a lot of people get derailed in their read through the Bible program. When they get to about February or so, and they're in Leviticus, and they're getting overwhelmed with all of these details of all of these rituals and ritual washings and sacrificial rites, they just give up and say, I'll just go back to reading some Psalms or something like that. I understand that temptation, and there might even be a temptation tonight as we go into some details. I'm going to ask you to hold on tight. It's worth it to pay attention to the details. It's the details of what is happening in Leviticus that actually make our understanding of what Christ has done that much richer. Maybe just an analogy to help. I remember when I was probably like late middle school, or maybe late elementary school, my dad went out and bought this, at the time, 27-inch tube TV. Now listen. We were the envy of the neighborhood with this bad boy, okay? I mean, our Nintendo games never looked so crisp on our 8-bit system. And like we didn't have to sit as close anymore to the TV to see it. We could sit like 5-6 feet back. It's amazing. Nowadays, if you invited someone over your house and said, hey, we're going to watch the Super Bowl in this, they would be offended. I mean, honestly, if you have anything less than like 65 inches, please don't invite me over to your house for the Super Bowl. It's ridiculous. It's like offensive to do so. Nowadays, you walk into Costco and you're bombarded by these giant HD TVs, right? And in HD, you see all the details. I don't even know what the bits are anymore for video games. I don't play video games, but I'm sure it's a lot better than 8-bit. And you can see the details. Well, my goal for us tonight is by first looking in detail at Leviticus 16, I think what it'll give us is an HD vision of the work of Christ. In some ways, things I'm going to say tonight are going to sound somewhat familiar, but I'm going to suggest that without understanding this backdrop, you're probably looking at the work of Christ more in the 27-inch tube TV. We want to look at it in the 75-inch HD TV. With, curved screen, surround sound, all of that. So that's what we're looking at tonight. So we're looking at the Day of Atonement, the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is pictured in this day. So here we are in Leviticus chapter 16. Leviticus 16 is the center of Leviticus. It comes after chapters 11 and 15, which is the cleanliness codes, and it comes right before the holiness code, starting in chapter 17. And it sticks right in the middle of the book. And this whole chapter is dedicated to one single day in Israel's calendar. One day, the whole chapter. It's actually not referred to in Leviticus 16 as the Day of Atonement. Leviticus 23 refers to it as that, but it's clear what it's referencing. But the word atonement appears 16 times in this chapter, 16 times. And you might know it perhaps by its Jewish name, especially if you grew up in Jewish areas. So like I grew up in Philadelphia, which has a heavily Jewish population, and so the public schools actually got off because we had so many teachers who were Jewish. It was known as Yom Kippur. I think I said it Yom Kippur at the time or something. I had no idea what Yom Kippur was, but I was just glad I got off from a day from school. But Yom Kippur, to this day, is the most holy day in the Jewish calendar and is a legal holiday in the modern state of Israel. If you're going to go to Israel on Yom Kippur, there'd be no radio or television broadcasts. Airports would be shut down. There'd be no public transportation. Businesses would be closed. It's even more widely celebrated there than what we do for Christmas here. And so it's held annually about 6 months after Passover. The end of Leviticus 16 gives the details of the calendrical schedule, but it's usually in either October or September. This year, it's going to be starting at sunset October 1st, and it'll finish sunset October 2nd in 2025 is Yom Kippur this year. Well, for us to understand the atonement, we need to get at what does this idea of atonement even mean? Some people have suggested, well, it's just a simple definition, just looking at the word. It means an at-one-ment. And honestly, for a basic definition, it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad attempt. It's the idea of being at one with God, having peace with God. But really, it kind of misses the mark a little bit because this idea focuses more on the effect of atonement, what atonement produces, not on atonement itself. And so we need to get at some other ideas of understanding of atonement. Atonement does provide an averting of God's wrath so that we can be with him, but how does it do that? What is the mechanism that's taking place according to the Bible that explains how we can be in God's presence? That's what atonement is wrestling with. So let me give you three ideas here, two core ideas, and then we'll dive into the passage to keep explaining it. But it gets at this idea of cleansing. The atonement is a cleansing. You could think of it in a sense, it's kind of like an annual spring cleaning for the whole nation, except it's in the fall. But what they're cleaning from is not physical dirt per se, but spiritual defilement. Anything that can defile you as a result of being a sinner or living in a fallen world is needing cleansing. It needs an atonement to provide for it. So it's this ritual cleansing or purifying, especially from sins. Leviticus describes, Leviticus just get done. The previous 4 chapters are all describing all the different ways you can be defiled. And there's a lot of ways you can be defiled that aren't in themselves intrinsically sinful, but it's a result of living in a fallen world. And he even says in verse 31 of chapter 15, right? Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness, by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. So if you can't just I don't mind getting a little dirty. My kids play in the dirt all the time. Well, no, this kind of uncleanness, this kind of ritual impurity actually is deserving of death. Without being cleansed, you could not be in God's presence. You would be deserving of death. So Leviticus describes this atonement that's needed to be clean. But another idea, and even more central, especially to our passage here, is the idea that atonement is a ransom payment. Atonement is a ransom payment. Now, when we think of a ransom payment, we tend to use that word maybe in like a movie that's talking about kidnapping or something like that. Well, in a kidnapping, what happens? Well, the guilty person, the bad guy, kidnaps someone's child, let's say, and then demands a ransom payment from the child's family, asking them to pay this price to get the child back, right? That's typically how we think of a ransom payment. So in our conception of a ransom, it's the innocent party, the child's family, who pays a ransom price, a ransom payment, to the guilty party, the kidnapper. The thing is, to understand what's happening in the Bible and to understand atonement, that's exactly opposite of how it works in the Bible. If that's the understanding you're bringing to it, when you hear the word ransom, you're going to misunderstand what the Bible's trying to get you to understand. Let me try to illustrate exactly how it works. Turn back with me, if you want, here to Exodus 21. Exodus 21, this is case law. But what's important about this case law is it illustrates what's happening in atonement. So let me just read verse 28 here of Exodus 21. Moses writes, "When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable." So here's a situation. Probably not a situation happening. This is probably not part of your HOA rules, okay? But apparently this was a problem in ancient Israel. Oxes going around goring people. All right. So in this first part of the case law, this ox gores somebody. Yeah, the ox deserves to die because they killed somebody, so the ox gets killed. But the owner of the ox isn't liable. He isn't killed because his ox killed somebody. He has a financial loss, apparently, right? He loses the ox, but nothing's threatening his life. But keep going in the case law, verse 29. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned, but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, just like before. But also in this case, its owner shall be put to death. So if you have this, ox that's a known gorer, and you've been warned, and you didn't do anything about it, you didn't lock him up or shut him in or do something to try to prevent the goring, then you are responsible. In fact, you're responsible to receive the same result of what happened to this person. The ox gets killed and you get killed because you took the life of an innocent person. You're now the guilty person, so you pay the penalty. All that makes sense. But there's an exception to that. This is the most important part. This is the part I want you to focus on. Verse 30. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. Here's what the Word of God is laying out here. It's saying that, for instance, I'll give you a scenario. So let's say a wife gets gored, and the husband, right? The husband just lost his beloved wife, his best friend. He loved his wife. He didn't want to lose his wife, and so he's within his legal right to let you, the ox owner, die. You, according to the law, you deserve death, and if he just did nothing, and the penalty got imposed on you, that's just. That's right. He doesn't do anything about it. You deserve to die, you die. However, if the husband, despite the fact that he lost his beloved wife, wants to be merciful to you, what he can do is impose a ransom payment that you can pay and then, therefore, will not have to die. So what happens is the guilty party pays the ransom price to the innocent party to spare their life. And that's a redemption price. They're redeeming their life by paying the ransom. They don't have to be offered a ransom. It's just not to offer them a ransom. They can just let them die. But if they want to be merciful, they can offer a ransom payment to the guilty party. And they can redeem their life by paying the ransom. So the way it works, it's an act of grace. It's optional, but the ransom payment delivers you from death and restores the relationship. At least in a legal sense, there's no debt that you owe them anymore. You're restored. They have no claim against you anymore if you pay that price. So in Leviticus, it's a sacrifice for sin that's a ransom for those who deserve death. The other piece to explain what's happening in Leviticus 16, to understand really the whole sacrificial system, is this. Flip over to Leviticus 17. Take what we just read in Exodus 21 and pair it together with this verse, and this gives you the rationale undergirding the atonement. In Leviticus 17, this is talking about, the context is not eating blood, but again, it's the rationale that explains the atonement. Here's what it says. For the life of the flesh is in the blood. Well, he's just making the simple point of like the reason that the blood represents someone's life is because when the blood drains out of somebody's body, they're dead, right? So blood represents life or death. And he goes on, he says, and in Hebrew it's emphatic. He's making an emphasis here. And I, God, the Lord God, have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. What he's saying is this. God is the giver of all life. All life comes from God. And so God is deciding graciously to provide the means to pay the death penalty ransom that we owe him by sacrificing animals on an altar. He's offering that as a substitute, as a bloody substitute. For the life you owe, you can let this animal count for you. Well, why does that count for you? Because God decided it to be so. Because he decides to make it so. God is offering you a way to pay the ransom payment for your life that you owe as a debt of your sin. And he's saying, I'm going to let the blood of this animal count for you. Now, we understand where this is going, don't we? Right? Hebrews 10:4. For the blood of bulls and goats can never pay for our sin. Ultimately speaking, that's not going to work long term. We know that. This is what Leviticus wants us to see. But what's important at this point is understanding the logic that's undergirding the atonement. You have to understand the logic of how the Levitical system works to appreciate what it means to talk about Christ's atonement for you. This is how you get that HD vision. You got to squint a little bit up front, but then it's beautiful. So last thing I'll say about it is it's a cleansing, it's a ransom payment. An atonement is also, it's deadly serious. It has to do with life and death. So diving into the passage here, look at the first two verses. Look how this is how the Day of Atonement passage starts off. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. What he's referring to here is what happened back in Leviticus chapter 10. In Leviticus 10, you can go back and read it. We won't look at it right now. His two oldest sons, Aaron's two oldest sons, Aaron is Moses' brother. He's the high priest. His two oldest sons help him in that work. It says they offered strange fire before the Lord, and the fire came out and consumed them. What's interesting is because just a few verses earlier, they just started the whole sacrificial system in the end of chapter 9, and the fire comes down and consumes the offering and takes the life of the offering instead of killing them. But then a few verses later, the first priest to do it, more or less, they botched the whole thing. It doesn't give us a lot of descriptions for what they're doing wrong exactly, but I think they're not following the prescriptions that he lays out here in chapter 16. They drew near before the Lord, is what he says. They tried to go into the presence of the Lord, but they weren't prepared to do so, and they were killed. To go into the presence of God, to be close to God, to draw near to God, when you are unprepared to do so, is life and death. It's not like, well, I'm not really in the mood right now, I'll come back later. No, it's life and death. And so Moses says in verse 2, and the Lord said to Moses, he's telling Aaron through Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. He's referring to the innermost part of the tabernacle, the part behind the giant veil where we refer to as the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, which is where the mercy seat is, which is representing the very presence of God. He's saying, don't ever go in there or you will die too, like your sons died. That is the spot that represents the presence of God. And think about where we've been so far in the story, right? In the story of God's people, they were in slavery in Egypt. God redeemed them out of Egypt, and he led them through to Mount Sinai, either with the pillar of cloud by night, a pillar of fire by night, or cloud by day, fire by night, and he brings them to Mount Sinai. And he brings them to this mountain, and the glory cloud rests upon Mount Sinai, and he tells them, don't even touch the mountain while God's presence is there, or you will die. And he gives them the instructions from Mount Sinai to build this tabernacle that will represent his presence. And when the tabernacle is done being built, instead of just hovering over all of Mount Sinai, God's presence zeroes in specifically on the tabernacle and even more focused right on top of the mercy seat inside the Holy of Holies. It is the fullest manifestation of the presence of God. It is the closest you can get to God on earth. This is what Exodus 25 says. He says, there I will meet you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony. I will speak with you about all I give to you in commandment for the people of Israel. So he's talking to Moses, and he's going to transfer this access to only the high priest. And so at the end of the book of Exodus, right before Leviticus, this is the last chapter, the last couple of verses, it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now even Moses wasn't allowed to go in. Moses himself couldn't be before God's presence in that way. And he says in verse 2, don't you dare ever go behind that veil, or you will die. But then he says in verse 3, except in this one way, you can enter in to the Holy of Holies. In verse 3, in this way, Aaron shall come into the holy place. He means the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. And here he goes into describing this day of atonement. The passage kind of unfolds in 3 steps. First, it talks about preparing for atonement. It talks about all the things they need to do to prepare for the atonement. And then it talks about the actual rituals of atonement themselves. And then lastly, it talks about instituting this day as a permanent statute. So those are kind of the 3 waves of chapter 16. So first, how do they prepare for this holy place? Verse 4, I think, is actually what's happening chronologically. The high priest Aaron, first Aaron as the only high priest, and then after he dies, other high priest. The high priest shall put on, verse 4 says, the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen undergarment on his body, and shall tie the linen sash around his waist, and wear the linen turban, and these are the holy garments. The holy garments. And so, and then he also says he shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. So he's got to wash himself, and then he's got to put on these 3 pieces of linen vestment, priestly vestment, for this special day. What might not be immediately obvious in the passage is this. This is set against the backdrop of Exodus 28. In Exodus 28, there's very detailed descriptions for what the high priest is supposed to wear all the time. The high priest was supposed to wear this beautiful vestment with all this embroidery and these gold and jewels. And when he wore his high priestly garments, he looked more like a king than anything else. It was made to make him stand apart from the people, to be above the people, separate from the people, fancier than the people, recognized as more important than the people. This is the normal clothes that the high priest is supposed to wear all the time, to look like a king, except on the Day of Atonement. For this one day, he's supposed to put on these very simple linen garments that makes him look more like a servant than a king. On this day, he needs to embrace humility because he's going before the presence of the Lord. So he needs special clothes for this day. He's stripped down to look like a slave on this special day in humility. The other thing he needs to do to prepare for atonement is gathering the sacrificial animals. It's one of those things where you can get lost in the details of all the animals, but there is 5 animals on this day. There is 2 for the priest. The priest gathers 1 bull for a sin offering, and he gathers 1 ram for a burnt offering. But then he also gathers, the high priest gathers 3 animals for the people. 2 goats for sin offerings, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. So they both have, there's this pattern throughout Leviticus 16 of for the priest, for the people, for the priest, for the people, for the priest, for the people, over and over again. The priest needs animals for sacrifices for his atonement before he can sacrifice the animals for the people's atonement. He needs it just as much as they need it. And so he has each of them, the priest and the people, have a ram for a burnt offering that happens at the end of the day. And they both have animals for a sin offering. 1 bull for the priest, that's typical for a priestly sacrifice in Leviticus chapter 4. And what's interesting about this passage is 2 goats for the sin offering for the people. 1 will be killed and 1 will be sent away alive. There's 2 goats. In fact, in verses 6 and following, it describes, in verses 8, it describes how they choose which goat is what. He says in verse 8, "And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and use it as a sin offering, but the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel." So you see that phrase pops up several times there. If you have another Bible, you might have a different translation. Some translations have the word scapegoat there instead of Azazel. Well, what that represents, just to explain what you're seeing in your translations, is there's some dispute over exactly how to translate that word. And so when translators don't know how to translate something, they just punt. So Azazel is not a translation. All they did was just represent the Hebrew sound in English letters. I think the traditional meaning is best. Az is just the Hebrew word for goat, and azal is for the verb to send away. It's a goat that's sent away. Some people get if you read some stuff on this, they get, maybe it means like just complete destruction, or maybe it means just a place in the wilderness. A popular interpretation is that it's referring to some goat demon that roams the wilderness, and they're sending this goat out to the goat demon, send it back to the demon it came from, that idea. I think all that's misguided. I think it's just the traditional understanding is best. It's a scapegoat. The idea is that it's sent away. It's a goat that is sent away from the people of God. And this is how ancient translations have understood it too, like the Greek and the Latin. Okay, so now that the priest has washed and put on the holy garments, now the priest has gathered these 5 different animals, now he actually offers atonement. In the offering of atonement, this is the center point of the day, there's 3 ritual rites that take place on this day. There's a sin offering for the priest and the people, there's the scapegoat ritual, and there's a burnt offering at the end of the day. That's the sequence they happen on this day. So don't get lost in the details. Keep the big picture in mind. Sin offering, priest, people, scapegoat ritual, and then burnt offering for both at the end. So let's walk through these. The actual accomplishment of atonement here in Leviticus 16. First, it's the sin offerings. The sin offerings start in verse 11. It says, "And Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and it shall bring it," this is a key word right here. Remember, he told Aaron before, "I'll kill you if you do this." For he's telling them, you can go inside the veil. It says, "And put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is over the testimony, so that he does not die." What he's describing here is this. You're supposed to slaughter the bull and have its blood drip into some sort of pan, takes another sort of pan and takes some coals from the altar out in the courtyard, put it in another pan, put some incense on top of it so it's beaten small, and it starts making like a smoke cloud. And he's saying that even after you washed yourself ritually, even after you put on these special clothes, even after you entered with the bull's spilt blood, ready to sprinkle it, you still need to enter into my holy presence under a cloud of smoke so that it's not quite visible. When Moses asked to see the face of God in Exodus 33, he said, no man can look at me and live. He passed by him, he put his hand over him, so to speak, in the cleft of the rock and said, you can see me from behind. So here Aaron is entering in to the most holy place, the ritual washings and the holy garments and the pan of bull's blood from the altar, and underneath a cloud of incense that's filling the room. So it's smoke. The close analogy I can think of is sometimes beekeepers enter into a dangerous scenario, but they first smoke the bees, so they're kind of subdued, and they go in and they get the honey. The analogy breaks down, but it's a similar idea. He's taking his life in his hands to do this. And so, notice though, that when he brings this, most of the parts of this ritual, when you compare it to Leviticus chapter 4, are pretty normal, right? The bull is sacrificed, there's a sevenfold sprinkling of blood, the unused parts are burned up, all that is the same. It's what's different that's highlighted. The two differences here are entering in to the Holy of Holies and with the cloud of incense. And before he does it, he has to come and sprinkle the bull's blood. And notice what it says. I read it here in verse 11. He has to sprinkle the bull's blood for himself. Shall make atonement for himself, a sin offering for himself. Back in verse 6. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself. Later, down in verse 17, it says that no one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement for the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself. And he says again in verse 24, he says, make atonement for himself. 7 times the passage emphasizes that before the priest can do anything to help anybody else, he first needs to make a sacrificial offering for himself. Because the priest, like all the people, is a sinner. The priest, like all the other people that he's there to represent, deserves to die without following God's work of atonement. And then he goes and repeats the same steps in verses 15 and following for the people. Except this time, instead of a bull's blood, he uses the goat's blood. And each time he goes in, he's told to sprinkle it on the mercy seat 7 times. And each time is reminding, this blood should have been mine. This blood that I'm looking at from this animal whose neck I just slit and drained into this bowl should be my blood. I deserve to die. I'm the guilty party. But this blood is the ransom payment that you said can count for me. In your grace and your mercy, you offered a way that I don't have to die. And he sprinkles it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just for himself. And then he repeats the same steps again with the blood of the goat for the people. And this time he walks out and he does it in the Holy of Holies. He comes out and he does it in the tent of meeting on the altar of incense. And he goes out and he does it again on the altar of burnt offerings in the courtyard. Walking backwards, so to speak, from the most holy to the least holy. There is some tradition, maybe you've heard of this, of there's kind of a legend that the priest would, they'd tie like a rope around his leg, or there'd be a bell, so in case he dies, they'd drag him out. Well, that's a great story and all. There's just no evidence for it in the Bible anywhere, or anywhere in later Jewish tradition. And there's a lot of Jewish tradition that comments a lot on the Day of Atonement, but they say nothing about that. That originates sometime in the Middle Ages and has taken on a legend of its own. So I don't think that's true. At least there's no evidence for it being true. But I think what it illustrates and what it highlights is true. Because what he says in verse 17, no one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters to make atonement in the holy place until he comes out and has made atonement for himself and for his house and for all the assembly of Israel. He and he alone. The other priests can't even be where they're usually allowed to be when he's in the Holy of Holies. They're not even allowed inside the tent of meeting when he's in the Holy of Holies. Complete restriction of access to God's presence. And so, that is the two sin offerings. And then, the other thing that is most highlighted on the Day of Atonement, it's the fact that there's two main features in the Day of Atonement that are different than any other ritual. It's that he can enter the Holy of Holies, and the second thing is the scapegoat ritual. And so we see that in verse 20 and following. He says, and when he has made an end of atoning for the holy place and the tent of meeting and the altar, remember, he's got to sprinkle all three. Boom, boom, boom. 7 times, working from in to out. Then he says, he shall present, in verse 20, the live goat. And they cast lots to decide which one was which. And it says in verse 21, and Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins. He presses earlier in Leviticus when they representatively put a hand on the goat showing the transfer of their sins, they just used one hand. But on the Day of Atonement, they used 2 hands. Either to show an intensification of the representation, or maybe one hand for the priest and one hand for the people. But either way, it's this idea of pressing down and transferring. Transferring what? Comprehensively. He uses 3 different terms for their sin. It talks about their iniquities, their transgressions, their sins. And it says in the second half of verse 21, and he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. And it says, and the goat shall bear all the iniquities on itself to a remote area. And he shall let the goat go free in the wilderness. The phrase remote area, literally the Hebrew is to a land of cutting off. Most of the Day of Atonement's rituals were done in private, out of the view of the people. It's a solemn day, it was a holy day, they're all gathered to watch, but they can't see most of it. But this was public. And this they saw, the goat being brought out of their presence, leaving the tabernacle courtyard, sent out. And in fact, Jewish tradition describes the fact that as the goat went out, the people were involved in it. They would spit at the goat. They'd pull its wool. They'd prick it to show their hatred for their sin, which is represented by the goat. The goat becomes the sin bearer, their sin. And the hatred for their sin is what they mete out in this goat. Jewish tradition also describes the fact that they would walk the goat backwards off a cliff to kill it. Whether that is actually what happened or not, the reality that they're trying to describe is the goat is not coming back. He's sent off into a land of cutting off, not to return. The sins are removed from their presence. There's a public removal. It shows the effect of atonement happening in their presence. And then verses 23 to 28 describe the last ceremony of the day, which is the burnt offerings. And so in verse 23, the high priest has to come back, and now he washes again, and he gets changed out of the linen garments back into his normal high priestly garb. And now he offers the rams for both him and the people for the burnt offering. But it's not just him who has to be ritually cleaned. He had 2 helpers to make this happen. One of them was the guy who walked the goat out, the goat walker guy, the designated guy, probably a priest. And then there was another guy who finished burning the leftover parts of the sin offering. They had to burn it all up. They didn't let even the choicest part, even the part they usually got to keep, like the filet mignon of the bull, you know? The priest didn't get to eat that day. He had a helper burn that up too. So they all had to be cleaned up before they can come back in. And look what it says in verse 20, at the end of 26 and at the end of 28. They had to do this After they cleaned and changed, afterward he may come into the camp. 28, afterward he may come back into the camp. Again, all to visually represent, we just got done removing the sin. We don't want to redefile it because you touched the goat. You touched the sin offering. You can't come back in until you've been cleansed again to be returned to the presence of God's people. And then at the end, verses 29 and to the end of the chapter, it describes the responsibility of the people. Everything we've seen so far is the responsibility of the priest for what he's supposed to do with his helpers. But now the people themselves. He says, this will be a statute for you forever in verse 29. He says, and you shall afflict yourselves. This is a common phrase. It means to humble yourselves with fasting, deprive yourself, and do no work. Either the native or the stranger who sojourns among you, anyone who's in the people of Israel is required to do this. This was the only required fast day for all of Israel. Other days had partial fasts. This is the only required fast day. And the atonement, for it to take effect, for it to actually work, the people had to represent a humility and a contrition for their sins. They had to understand that they deserved this and they needed this for it to count for them. Verse 30, for on this day shall atonement be made for you to cleanse you, and you shall be clean before the Lord from all your sins. It's a Sabbath of Sabbath, a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict yourselves. And he describes how in verse 33, how he made atonement for the holy sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the innermost part. He made atonement for the tent of meeting, inside the tent of meeting, the altar of incense, and for the altar of burnt offerings out in the courtyard. And then he shall make atonement for the priests and atonement for all the assembly of the congregation. And this will be a statute forever. And he shall make atonement for the people of Israel in the year, once a year, because of all their sins. 3 times he describes this being a permanent statute to keep. The reason it needed to be a permanent statute is because, inevitably, somehow, sin got back into the camp. It got back in because every time any of them entered into it, they brought the sin with them. You see, this public solemn ritual was to remind them every year of how serious their sin was and how serious it was for them to be in the presence of God. This is the only way for a sinful people to dwell in the midst of a holy God. And yet, there's a fundamental flaw in the whole thing. It kept getting messed up and need to be redone every year, over and over and over again. Think about it. Even with all of these intricate details, this ornate description of this ceremony, think about how restricted their access to God was. It was only the high priest. And only once a year. And only after he ritually washed. Only after he put on his special holy garments. Only after he offered atonement for himself. And only with a cloud of incense that clouded his vision could he then, once a year, enter into the presence of God. And if he didn't do those things, he'd be killed. This couldn't last forever. It was never meant to. You'd be reading the Bible backwards if you thought the New Testament author was like, oh, you know what? We're Jews and all that stuff in the Old Testament. Hey, we can make some analogies to explain this gospel thing about Jesus. No. God gave these rituals to his covenant people to prepare them and to prophetically proclaim and to typologically picture and to point them to the ultimate reality. What happens here on earth in the physical realm is not the real reality. This is the shadow. The substance is the holy tabernacle in God's presence. That is the true reality. This is the shadow pointing to the substance. The atonement that we need is achieved by Christ on the cross. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 7. In our remaining time, I want to look at just a couple passages from the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews 7, he goes at great detail to explain to us the atonement that is achieved in our behalf. In Hebrews 7, look at verse 23. He says, Hebrews 7:23, for the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. What he's saying is, look, you needed another priest because one died and another took his place. Then he died, another took his place. The reason they died is because they're sinners and they deserve to die. And they die. And then another one's got to take their place. But Jesus, he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. He doesn't die. Well, yes, he died once, but then he rose from the dead, never to die again. It says, verse 25, consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. He doesn't die. He is pure and blameless. Verse 26 says, for it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest who is holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, then for the sins of the people, since he did this once, not once a year, once for all time, when he offered what? Not a bull, not a goat, not a ram. He offered himself. He doesn't need to make sacrifice first for himself before he does his priestly work. He's already pure and blameless and ritually clean and holy and undefiled and separated from all sin. He can hold his priesthood permanently because he's pure and does not die. And so he continues as our great high priest, continuing right now to do his priestly work. Right now, Jesus is before the throne of God interceding on your behalf. He doesn't stop doing it because he never dies and he never gets defiled. He keeps on doing it. The sacrifice is offered once for all, but he continues to intercede. And the sacrifice himself is eternally effective. Look at chapter 9. The first 10 verses are really just describing what we just read in Leviticus. If you want to read another description, read it right there. But then he says in verse 11, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is not of this creation, he's referring to the very throne room of God itself. He entered the ultimate Holy of Holies. He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood. Thus he secured not a temporary redemption, an eternal redemption. He paid that ransom price. For the blood of bulls and goats and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctified for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? You see, Jesus is not only our high priest who's pure and permanent in his priesthood interceding on our behalf, he's actually also the sacrifice itself. And this sacrifice doesn't need to be repeated. It didn't run out. It's eternally effective. Hebrews 10:14, he says, for by a single offering, think about how many offerings they had to do just in the Day of Atonement. They needed 5 animals just for that one day. And it didn't even last. For by a single offering, he's perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And even though Hebrews doesn't pick up the imagery of the scapegoat, I think Isaiah does. Isaiah 53:6 says, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It says he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressions. Jesus was the sin-bearing goat. He was cut off from the land of the living. He was sent into the land that was cut off. That's why Psalm 103:12 can says, as far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. They're brought away from our presence as the effect of atonement that we can see. That's why he's also a ransom. Mark 10:45 says he gave his life a ransom for many. You see, God didn't have to even impose a ransom. He would have been just to let you die in your sin. You deserve it. You sin, It's perfectly just for you to pay the penalty of your sin. For the day you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. The wages of sin is death. Every single one of you have sinned, me included. We deserve to die, and God will be perfectly just to let you die. But in his mercy, like the ox goring wife's husband, in his mercy and his grace, he offers a ransom payment. Not only that, he pays the ransom payment himself. That'd be like the husband whose wife got killed. You know what? You can have a ransom to buy back your life, but I'll pay it for you. And he gave his own son to pay that ransom. He did it for us. And so the effect of that is that we can now draw near to God. So when he says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 18, where there's forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin. Verse 19, therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is through the flesh. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw nearer with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. What in the Old Testament, only the high priest, only once a year, only with ritual washing and holy garbs and bulls, sprinkled blood of bulls, goats, and only with incense altar could enter into in a cloudy room once a year. You get to be in every single day. We are in the Holy of Holies. We can be in the very presence of God. What we get to experience is greater than what any Old Testament saint, including the high priest, could only experience once a year. Don't you understand? This is the HD vision I was trying to tell you about. We get closer to God than even the high priest could even attempt to get at once a year. That's the access that Christ has won for us through his atoning work. That's what the cross of Christ has done. And he says, draw near. And so when you feel not very close to God, remember it's not based on how you feel, it's based on what Christ has done. Christ has opened the way into the Holy of Holies and brought you with him. And he continues right now before the throne of the Father. When you're tempted by sin and you feel like you've messed up, he says, whoa. I paid for his sin. Here's my blood that paid for it. That one's one of mine. I'm interceding on his behalf. And that blood is my blood that I spilt for him. I paid that ransom payment. This is the picture of the cross of Christ the Day of Atonement is meant to give us. And so when you sing songs like the lyrics from Before the Throne of God Above, let them sink a little deeper. I'll close by just reading these. It says, before the throne of God above, the heavenly holy of holies, I have a strong and perfect plea, not based on what you do. We have a great high priest whose name is love, who ever lives and pleads for me. My name is graven on his hands. My name is written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me thence depart. When Satan tempts me to despair, makes you feel like you're not close to God, and tells me the guilt within, I don't think I can pray right now. I don't think I should read the Bible. I feel guilty. Upward I look and see him there who made an end to all my sin. Because the sinless Savior died, my sinful soul is counted free. For God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me. Behold him there, the risen Lamb, my perfect, spotless righteousness, the great unchangeable I am, the King of glory and of grace, one with himself, I cannot die. My soul is purchased by his blood. My life is hid with Christ on high, with Christ my Savior and my God. Let's pray.